NBC News correspondent Leigh Caldwell joining me now from Capitol Hill. And Leanne, tell us about this bill. What is in it?
Allison, this bill is a direct response to the latest atrocities that have been happening to Black Americans at the hands of police. So what is in it? What it includes: it bans chokeholds, which is how George Floyd died. It bans no-knock entries in drug cases, just like how Breonna Taylor died. It does both of those things by tying federal funding to police departments implementing these reforms. It also attempts to hold police departments accountable and individual police accountable by creating a national database of police misconduct, and it collects data on police use of force as well. There's another interesting thing about this legislation, Allison, is that it does not increase money for police departments in order for them to implement their reforms. It doesn't shrink police department budgets either, like some activists are calling for, but it is an acknowledgement that this defund police movement does have a lot of power and a lot of sway, especially among Democrats who acknowledge that it is a local issue to defund the police and what they want to do with their budgets, but also that Democrats completely support funding other programs such as mental health and schools, things to make lives better for Black Americans who have been completely disenfranchised in the system. So this is a bill that Democrats tell me is much more narrow than some would have liked. They want to try to get it through Congress, and Speaker Pelosi called this just a first step.
Leanne, I have to ask, House Democrats introduced it. Does it have any Republican support?
It has no Republican support at this moment, and it could be difficult to get that, especially since President Trump tweeted just an hour or two before the Democrats unveiled this legislation, tying them to the defund the police movement, calling Democrats crazy radicals, and insisting that he is the law and order president. So he is trying to make this issue a political issue. This is an issue that he ran on successfully in 2016 of law and order, and it looks like he's intending to do that again. But here's what Democrats have to say to that.
Now, some Senate Republicans have acknowledged egregious wrongs, but few have expressed a need for floor action. Too many have remained silent. Maybe they're hoping the issue goes away. I promise them it will not.
I think that in terms of the law and order message that the president is spewing out of there, there's nothing new about that message, and I do not believe it will be successful.
This bill will pass the Democratic-led House of Representatives, most likely. But the bigger challenge is when it gets to the Republican-led Senate. Now, we haven't had any Republicans who have come out and outright panned this legislation, saying that it is dead on arrival. They have not done that. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said that he's going to take a look. Senator Tim Scott, the only Black Republican in the Senate of South Carolina, he said that he is going to release his own proposal this week as well. So while they might not take up the Democrats' bill wholesale, there could be some room for compromise. But with the president in there, tweeting, really trying to make this a wedge issue, it still has a huge uphill battle before it gets to the president's desk, Allison.
Leanne, a House Democratic aide confirmed to NBC News that George Floyd's brother, Philonise Floyd, will testify before the House Judiciary Committee on Wednesday. What do you know, and what can you tell us about that hearing?
So that hearing is about racial profiling in the police department. It's about community policing and how the police interact with the community. But the fact that George Floyd's brother is testifying is really an opportunity to give him a platform, to give him an ability to speak about his brother, about what happened. And so it's going to be perhaps a very powerful moment in this broader picture of Democrats trying to address these issues in a legislative way, but also while using the platform they have to give people who are instrumental in this debate the ability to speak, Allison.
All right, Leigh Caldwell on Capitol Hill. Great to see you. Thank you.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.